Welcome to this episode of UK Property News, where we interview the UK's leading property experts on the latest UK property market updates. In this episode, our host Ian Collins sits down with Allison Thompson, National Lettings Managing Director from LRG, who shares her expert insight on the UK rental markets in 2026. Together, they explore rental growth predictions and the impact of the Renters' Rights Act for landlords and tenants, and most importantly, what landlords really need to be doing right now to prepare for the Renters' Rights Act implementation on 1st of May 2026. As we move into the biggest year of change in the UK's private rented sector, make sure you subscribe to Landlord Investor TV for regular episodes of UK property news brought to you by the National Landlord Investment Show. To stay informed and ahead, subscribe today.
Tracy, thank you. And Allison Thompson is with us, National Lettings Managing Director with LRG. Good to see you, Allison.
Good to see you too, Ian.
Lots to talk about here. Let's just start with the obvious one. The rental market is 2026. It's never out of the headlines. What's it looking like right now?
So as we enter 2026, there's definitely a bit of a shift. There's slightly less competition. The rent growth is easing. So we had this sort of really steep, sharp rise in rents over the last couple of years, and that rent growth is easing. There's still the there's still the supply and demand dynamic, that's still there, but rents will continue to grow this year, but they are definitely growing at a slower pace. And I think the other thing to note about the rental market in 2026 is that tenant inquiries, we've noticed, have fallen by about 20% year on year.
That's interesting.
And we think, a lot of that is down to net migration has obviously changed. And also we're seeing that perhaps some of the first-time buyer mortgage affordability is maybe seeing some of those aspirational tenants that can afford to get on the housing ladder.
So they're buying.
Yeah, definitely. But I think the year will be probably one of slight cooling in the rent growth. We still need more supply, but I think it will start to stabilise this year following a couple of years of quite rapid growth. Yeah,
there's been a lot over the last couple of years. What are those sort of salient factors then in 2026 that are going to be guiding what happens to the market?
So I think there are probably four things. They are the biggest factor is going to be the implementation of renters' rights. And obviously we can come on to talk about that more specifically, but the biggest factor for me will be the implementation of renters' rights. So I think what will happen is, following this sort of period of high volatility, these really sharp rent rises, I think we're going to find a new normal with maybe a more structured and a more professionalised and regulated sector. I think, number one, the implementation of renters' rights, the supply and demand imbalance, it does remain undersupplied, like I said. There is also, I think, tenants' priorities are shifting, and I think there's a sort of value first priority, which is around, high energy efficiency accommodation and obviously the cost of living. So they're very conscious about, if they're paying sort of fairly decent amount in rent, they're looking at affordability in terms of bills, etc. And then the final one I think I mentioned is the easing in mortgage rates, is seeing some financial stability and seeing some of the potential aspirational tenants move into first-time buying.
Are tenants more discerning?
Definitely more discerning. They're definitely more selective. Definitely more selective.
And is that because, it's no great secret that, it's expensive to rent and it's expensive to buy a house. Property is a market that obviously, you need to have a certain amount of money there to enter it in whatever respect. And I guess there is a thinking, well, if I'm paying this much, I want something nice in return, not unreasonably.
Yeah, and I think, gone are the days where renting is a sort of slightly less, slightly more frowned upon option rather than purchasing.
That's
think,
true.
Definitely the standard of accommodation, and obviously with the introduction of potentially, decent home standard under the Renters' Rights Act, standard of accommodation for tenants, should be very, very, very good.
Yeah.
And it ought to be for the price that tenants
That's
are
true, because
paying.
it used to be a case, and I always use the sort of vaguely apocryphal example of, you wanted to rent somewhere and you met a guy in a pub and he was a friend of a friend. He went, yeah, I've got a room, or I've got this. And, it's 50 quid, that's a deposit, and off you went. I mean, you could never do any of that now for lots of reasons. But people used to sort of go, well, it's okay, this place I've got. I'm only renting, so it doesn't matter almost.
Yeah.
That's kind of gone.
Yeah. And people do put down roots even in rented accommodation. So, and people make it their homes. They invest in it, emotionally, as well as, in some cases, people do make adaptations to properties with landlords' permission. And I think, people will, if they are presented with a decent home, they'll invest in it, they'll look after it, and why shouldn't they?
Yeah, indeed. What about the Renters' Rights Act? For the last few years when we've talked about this, it was the Renters' Rights Bill. It is now an Act of Parliament. When does all of that come in? Has anything happened already? What's the detail there?
Yeah, so yes, so October 27th, I think it received royal assent. And the implementation phase, if you like, is a period for landlords and agents to adjust.
Yep.
The impact of the changes is 1st of May this year.
So it's not 1st of May, bang, everything happens. There's an incremental introduction to things.
Well, there is a sort of big bang day on the 1st of May, but the only thing that has happened thus far is at the end of December, local authorities got increased enforcement powers to be able to, if they had any suspicions around rogue landlords or rogue agents, they had powers to go and investigate and demand documentations. Those powers have increased. So that happened in December. And then from the 1st of May is really the big bang day where the sort of, the gavel drops and everything changes. But we've got between now and the 1st of May, certainly as landlords and agents, to make adjustments, make preparations for that 1st of May onwards.
And obviously, like any industry, when there's changes, and from doing the landlord investment shows and taking so many questions over the last few years, there was a lot of concern, there was a bit of unease, and much of that was just about confusion or not knowing what was going to happen. I think the upshot of that seems to be, Alison, that for want of a better word, if this professionalises the industry in areas that needed it, because I think most landlords are good landlords, it is their business, etc., and most agents are good agents, etc. But if it means you're on board and are more aware that you've got to do this correctly, there's a lot of people in the landlord industry saying that's a good thing. I mean, it might have been a bit of a pain to get to this stage, but actually it will kind of work out.
Yeah, it will. And I suppose a lot of people have been using the phrase, it levels the playing field, because everybody's got to abide by these rules.
Sure.
Agents, landlords alike, so there's, if you cut corners, then more for you really, because the fines are quite sizable.
They're pretty chunky, aren't they, if you get it wrong?
Yeah, definitely. But I think, ultimately, this is a good thing because it does raise the standards, it does uniform the standards, and like I said before, landlords ought to provide decent properties that are compliant, etc. But there is a lot to navigate because there is a lot to navigate. Obviously the changes do introduce some things that landlords and agents need to change processes and mindset around.
So you talk to a lot of landlords, obviously, Alison. What aspect or which aspect of this Act now is concerning landlords the most?
I think this all started with the abolition of Section 21 or no-fault evictions. And I think that was a sensationalised headline that then started people, panicking, thinking, I'll never be able to get possession of my property back. Well, that's incorrect. Of course, you can gain possession of your property back, but it will have to be evidence-based on certain grounds. So the actual technicality of serving a Section 21 notice is removed because with a Section 21, you never had to give a reason for wanting to gain possession of the property back. In the
it
new
still
world,
wasn't an easy process, though.
No. Yeah,
again, the headlines sort of suggested otherwise.
Yeah, it still requires the correct documentation to be served in a certain prescribed way, and if you get that wrong, then there are implications. The Section 21 notice being removed now. To gain possession, you use what's called a Section 8 notice, and certain grounds under that Section 8 notice allow you to gain possession back for your property if you choose to sell, if you choose to move back in, if there's been antisocial behaviour, if the tenant is in persistent rent arrears. So the normal things that perhaps landlords would have wanted to gain possession previously under Section 21 still exist. You've just got to evidence-base it and use a slightly different notice. And it's a sort of court-based process.
So it doesn't mean if you're a landlord and you have got genuine difficulties or you need to, move on yourself, whatever, the law of the land is not going to stop you from doing that. You've just got to follow a different protocol.
Yeah, I think what perhaps the government were intending with in introducing the Renters' Right Act, one of the intentions is to stop what they think was happening, which was landlords were just trying to get rid of a tenant for no apparent reason. There needed to be a justifiable one. And I think, yes, I'm sure that happened, but it was very, very infrequent.
Sure.
Now it's a case of serving the Section 8 as opposed to a Section 21. And as long as you can evidence your reasoning and you don't then say you want to put the property on the market for sale, the tenant moves out, and then you don't put the property on for sale, then that's not a genuine reason. Yeah.
But I mean, that a lot of this that's why you need a good agent, really, isn't it? Frankly, because you could the days of the one-man band. All right, it's doable if somebody wants to run their business like that. They might just have one property and it works. But actually, having the support of a proper agent, guys like yourselves, is becoming all the more crucial, really.
Yeah,
because there are bear traps you might
exactly that.
Fall
there are traps that you could inadvertently fall through. No, not intentionally, but
correct.
you could inadvertently fall through traps. Certain issues around compliance, certain audit trails and housekeeping that you need to have, and evidence-based conversations with tenants and maintenance requests, timely responses to that. All sorts of little traps you can fall into, and like you said, Ian, a good agent will just navigate you through that and make sure that you avoid those.
Indeed. What about the tenant perspective then? What are the kind of changes for a tenant that matter most?
I think we mentioned it earlier. I think affordability sort of is really starting to spike a little bit now. I mean, obviously off the back of quite high and sharp rent growth, I think most tenants are broadly welcoming all these changes. They're broadly welcoming the concept of, it does cost a landlord to license a property and make sure the fire regulations are in place. It does cost a landlord to get an EPC to a certain grade. The concept of that is fine. I think then what they perhaps feel is that all that'll do is be passed on in rent increases to them, to the tenants. So the concept of having a safe home, an energy efficient home is one thing, but the cost maybe inadvertently ends up on the rent. Yeah,
I was going to say, because that's the big question, isn't it? And of course it's a mixed picture. You have some landlords who, the rent pretty much just covers the mortgage in some cases. There might be a little bit left over, but those situations are there. Given this huge change in the landscape, new laws of the land, what are the kind of predictions for rental growth 2026? I know you touched on it at the beginning, but what's nationally and regionally?
Yeah,
what does that
so
look like?
I've got a couple of statistics here that I just looked at a bit earlier, but so using some of the sort of, the market prediction forecasts that, you can look at Rightmove, you can look at Zoopla, etc. They're sort of predicting the same thing. So they're predicting that nationally rent growth this year is likely to be somewhere between 2–2.5%.
Yep.
Whereas in prior years, that has sort of potentially capped out at about 5 or 6.
Right.
So it's growing, but the rate of growth is easing. Now, certain areas and certain pockets of the country are sort of bucking the trend a little bit in different ways. So London is slightly more suppressed. So I think those rent growths will be probably somewhere between 0.5% to 1 to 1.5%.
But it has previously grown disproportionately, hasn't it?
Correct, yeah. And then some hotspots, some sort of buy-to-let hotspots where there is good transport links, good employment opportunities, some places like Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, they're still seeing really, really sort of good rental yields, and those are predicted to stay strong. So in those areas, we will probably see something like 3.5 to 4. So there will be some pockets. It's mostly north, mostly sort of Midlands and upwards, where we'll see those pockets where the affordability is a bit less challenging.
Got it.
The rents are already a little bit lower.
Final point then, Alison, sort of all-encompassing point, I guess. What is the one thing from a landlord perspective now? What is the one thing that landlords should be doing now to prepare for these changes? Because there's quite a lot to get your head around if you're a landlord, but what's at the top of the list?
Yeah. So from the 1st of May, all assured short-hold tenancies become assured periodic tenancies, meaning that they are going into a rolling contract, which means that there is now no longer a fixed end date that a landlord probably would have relied upon to then maybe gain possession back of the property. So it's about making sure that you've had a look at your tenancy terms and you're familiarising yourself with what you thought were the tenancy terms prior to the 1st of May, and then what that becomes thereafter. So I think a good review of your legal documents is really important to understand what changes. And then I think gen up on the Section 8 grounds. Understand the grounds that you need to gain possession and what are the key areas in terms of, like I mentioned, persistent arrears, wanting to sell, wanting to move back in. Get familiar with that so that you're comfortable that when the time comes, if you're not talking to an agent, who obviously will handle that for you, but if you're not talking to an agent, get familiar with the grounds so that you understand when the time is right to gain possession. And then also familiarise yourself with when was the last time you increased the rent. Have a look at the market, have a look at your prior rent increase sort of processes, because one of the changes with renters' rights is that you can only increase your rent once a year, and that will be in line with market rates. So maybe you haven't looked at the rent for a period of time, and maybe now's the time to have a look at that.
Got it. Listen, Alison, great to see you again.
And you. Thank you very much for having me.
We will speak again soon. Allison Thompson from LRG with us on the programme.